Let's talk about the visit now. We're joined via Zoom by political analyst Professor Dirk Kotzé. Professor Kotzé, thank you very much for taking the time. Let's just first start with that fact that the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says President Joe Biden's administration sees Africa's 54 nations as equal partners in tackling global problems. But does history bear him out?
No, I don't think so. And I think this is part of the message, is that this document that was released today was about the approach of the United States towards Sub-Saharan Africa. So it does not include North Africa, but because it is such a huge part of the African continent in general, I think we can talk about it sort of in more general terms. But I think that the tone of his speech or his presentation of this new document that was released, therefore not only for South Africa but for a large part of the African continent, was much more that of being a co-partner, not anymore that of the superpower who comes in from the top and dictates to African countries what should be their approach and how they should deal with world issues and so on. Incidentally, he never referred to the war in the Ukraine during this presentation.
Okay, we'll talk about that, but you said something very important when you mentioned Sub-Saharan Africa and also its ideological meaning. Those who've been pushing for more progressive politics of Africa themselves have a problem with that. So if Antony Blinken is saying he's here to negotiate with Africa, seeing them as a particularly strategic partner in not only global politics, but the thrust. Should the thinking not even begin there to begin with? Because it said that that thinking is imperialist and it belies the old age thinking of Bretton Woods states, institutions.
Well, it never came up in this discussion. The introduction was done by Dr. Naledi Pandor, our Minister of DIRCO. She was, in a sense, very much endorsing the approach that the US was in the process of spelling out to her and presenting in this document and in his presentation also. And there was absolutely no reference to saying, well, this is an artificial distinction between about the African continent. So that was taken for granted as an approach that the US is following.
That's what I'm saying. If you are going to say that you are reflecting the region's complexity in its diversity, its agency, and you will focus on African nations and peoples, you see Sub-Saharan Africa as a major geopolitical force. Some of these inferences have their own ideological problematic ways of being seen. Is that not a point of departure to consider?
I don't think so. I mean, this is a point of debate, and different countries have different perspectives about it, and this is their approach. There wasn't any serious objection from the South African side, and there were quite a strong South African delegation there. So it's seen as an approach, Africa consists of 5 regions. It is the different regional organizations, ECOWAS, SADC, East African Community, and that's actually how the African Union and the African continent is composed of. It's in terms of these regional components. So in order to see it as one homogeneous continent which must be treated in equal terms, I think is very unrealistic.
Although I was talking about the Sub-Saharan Africa region and not the regional blocks. But fine, Professor, let's continue. The 4 most strategic points of discussion for the US and African nations to tackle shared priorities. Antony Blinken obviously mentioning how to recover from the pandemic, creating broad-based economic opportunities, addressing climate crisis, expanding energy access, revitalizing democracies. All of this have one word as the anchor Anchorage equity when he talks about an equal partnership. How would that play out?
Well, we will have to see. I mean, this is now a statement of objectives or statement of aims of how they want to approach their relationship, bilateral as well as multilateral relations with the African, sub-Saharan Africa then. They've identified, as you say, 4 specific priority areas. It's first about openness and open society, and therefore at the same time promoting of access to information. He made quite a lot about that, and also about the free flow of opinions and views. So in a sense, he wants, according to this, of opening up the space of internal debate, of news, of investigative journalism, and then about what he called the sharing the benefits of democracy. For example, talked about the idea that that elections are very important in terms of in different countries. He referred to tomorrow's election in Kenya and how important that will be for Kenya as a country. Then it gave quite a lot of attention to the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and what can be done and all the different aspects. He concentrated a lot on health and the health programs in which the US has been involved for many years in South Africa, specifically the HIV/AIDS, but also now the vaccination processes and how South Africa, especially South Africa, but other African countries also will become or will be enabled to become involved in the production of vaccinations, not only for COVID-19, but other possible viruses in the future.
Professor, before we
then I think what is very...
Okay, you can finish your train of thought.
And then the last point was about clean and the transition to clean or renewable energy. And I think that was the other component, which is a theme in terms of US relations with many countries in the world. But I think this is something which we all, obviously, because of Eskom and others, has become a major priority for South Africa.
The issue of the war in Ukraine has been a source of tensions, particularly diplomatically. South Africa's insistence on its non-aligned stance, the tensions with China, and as we mentioned, this is at the back of diplomatic efforts by Russia itself. How much will this position impact future trade relations and negotiations, particularly looking at the strong ties of Russia and China with the African continent, particularly investment ties?
Well, incidentally, in this presentation he made this afternoon, it was never mentioned. There was no reference to the war in Ukraine, about the relationships. He once referred to Russia, and that was in relation to the Wagner Group, the private or semi-private military group that has been involved first in Mozambique and now in Mali. But that was the only reference to it. So the focus, to some extent, I think we see very much from a public point of view, think that that is one of the main concerns. But in terms of the presentation itself, it was not at all. So I think what we are going to possibly see is that yes, there's at certain diplomatic levels, these matters are definitely discussed. It's not that I try to say it's not an issue at all. And I think this morning in the bilateral discussion that took place and where the media was also involved, there was possibly more of that that was discussed. But when it came to the broader context, not only South Africa, but as I said, the sub-Saharan African context, it was not discussed as a major issue as part of the relationship.
Thank you very much, Professor. In fact, Antony Blinken said, and I quote, "The United States' good relations with South Africa will allow them to be frank in discussing the differences between the two countries." Professor Dirk Kotzé, who is a political analyst, thank you very much for speaking to us, unpacking Antony Blinken's visit to South Africa. And of course, it's part of a several nation tour on the continent.